Welcome back to History 321. I am Dr. Ron Traylor, and this is video lecture number 19. We are still running our way through the late 20th century governors of Louisiana, and we are up to the election of 1988 now. Now, in 1988, United States Congressman Charles Romer, his nickname is Buddy Romer, Roemer. Buddy Romer was not given a chance by anyone to win the governor's office in that election, the election of 1988. He had refused money from PACs. Now, PAC, that means political action committees. Quite often, political candidates for political office pick up a lot of their funding from PACs. Romer said, nope, don't want anything to do with them. And the reason is that if I take their money, they will ask me to do things for them in return for their cash. And I want to remain independent. So, no money from PACs. He traveled around the state with a very small group of supporters. Now, there were other strong candidates who were running against the incumbent governor, Edwin Edwards. Remember, Edwin Edwards was wrapping up his third 4-year term as governor of the state, including in other candidates who were running against Edwards. Congressman Billy Tozan, for those of you who speak fluent Cajun, you know that that's spelled Tauzin and pronounced Tozan. Louisiana Secretary of State Jim Brown, and Congressman Robert Livingston. It was expected that Livingston, who was the only Republican in that group, would face Edwards in a runoff. Edwards' opponents attacked Edwards' politics and his character, and they began a campaign of ABE, Abe, anybody but Edwards. During the last 3 weeks of the campaign, Romer saturated the airwaves with political advertisements. He was endorsed by all of the state's major newspapers. He was perceived as presenting a true reform message of cleaning state government out and getting rid of special interest groups. He finished first. Now, he only had 33%. Now, remember, this was a general primary. Both Democrats and Republicans ran. So, Romer, the Republican, comes in first with 33% of the total vote, and Edwards came in second with a total vote of 28%. So it was not a majority, it was a plurality. And Edwards, though, at this stage of the game, realizes that his goose is cooked politically. He realizes that there is no way that he can beat Buddy Romer in a general election runoff between the two. And so he concedes the election. He pulls out. He gave Romer a little bit of parting advice. He said that election day would be the last happy day that Romer would have for a long, long time. And Romer, at the age of 43, becomes the new governor of the state of Louisiana. Now, Romer, we spent a lot of time in the previous video listing all the problems that Edwin Edwards faced in his third term as governor, or his third 4-year term as governor. And many of his problems were financial. They were economic problems. And the state of Louisiana was still in that in the grip of that economic depression when Buddy Romer becomes the governor. Unemployment was still the highest in the entire nation. Education ranked near the bottom nationally. So, by whatever metric you wanted to judge good or bad in Louisiana, we were pretty much at the bottom of everything that was bad. The political system had a well established reputation by now as being the most corrupt system in the entire United States. A few years after this, I uh, started graduate school at the University of Houston, and I had a professor there who said something that I have never forgotten, and I'll share it with you. He said that if you want to get an undergraduate degree in political corruption, then you can stay right there in Texas because that's where we were living at the time. He said, you can stay right here in Texas. You can go to UT Austin or you can go to Texas A&M and they will teach you all about political corruption. But he said, if you want to get an advanced degree in political corruption, you need to go to Louisiana because that's where the experts live. There was a huge state budget debt. We owed a lot more money here in Louisiana than we had money to pay. And Romer suggested a program that would have included cuts to higher education, to charity hospitals, to road construction, um, totally eliminating the state's ethanol subsidy. Now, what in the world is that? Well, remember that gasoline historically had been made from oil. Uh, but by the late 1980s and the early 1890s, it was discovered that you could take corn, for example, or any carbohydrate, and by properly using the right chemicals and the right process, you could make fuel that would burn. We call it ethanol. And Louisiana had dedicated a lot of money to ethanol. The state of Louisiana by this time was paying a lot of money to farmers to raise more corn, for example, and then converting that corn to ethanol and as its use as a fuel. And the ethanol, very little of that corn was being transformed into fuel yet because it takes a while for the technology to for the refinery to catch up the with the science. And so Roma said, "Look, um, we are wasting money here on something that on creating a fuel that's not in the pipeline yet. So let's cut the subsidies to Louisiana's corn farmers." Romer also insisted that Louisiana needed to end its historic dependence on business taxes to support state programs. He said that the difference should be made up by increasing historically low tax rates to our citizens. And it's true. The percentage that Louisianians paid in state taxes of all kinds was lower than just about any other state. And those who defended a higher tax rate said that those other states who did charge higher tax rates, um, they benefited from it. They had better roads, they had better schools, they had better health care, and so on and so on and so on. In 1988, Governor Romer calls a special session of the legislature to enact his economic reforms. Now, it might have passed. It might have passed, but Romer also suggesting lowering the homestead exemption on primary residences from $75,000 to $25,000. Now, we've not talked about homestead exemption at all in here. A homestead exemption is very simply this: we all pay property tax, and the tax assessor of our parish, he or his representatives will come to our home, and they will inspect our homes, and they will assign a value to that home. And that is the value then that will be used to figure out how much property tax we owe. Well, in the past in Louisiana, the first $75,000 of the value of your property was exempt from taxation. All right. Why they call it the homestead exemption. And so you only paid a property tax if your property was worth more than $75,000. The first $75,000 was exempt. Romer was suggesting that they dropped the homestead exemption amount back to $25,000. And what that means is that the typical U.S. Louisiana property owner is going to pay more in property tax. Now, and that additional property tax very well might have gone a long way in solving the state's financial problems. But the legislature refused to pass the property tax change. As a matter of fact, it voted down most of Governor Romer's proposed economic package. In 1989, he gave it another shot. He tried it again, this time with a little smaller package. It passed the legislature, but it was in the form of a constitutional amendment. It wasn't in the form of a bill. It was a proposed constitutional amendment, and before that amendment could go into effect, it had to be ratified by the citizens of Louisiana by a 2/3 vote of all those who voted. The people of Louisiana voted against the proposals, 55 to 45. So there was no way that any of this was going to work. So Romer had failed in his attempt to balance the state budget, and I say to drag the state of Louisiana kicking and screaming into the 20th century, even though the 20th century was almost over by that time. Now, so what do you do? Remember what Edwin Edwards had suggested in an earlier administration? He had said that the financial shortfall could be recovered by the use of casinos and the lottery. But that had been rejected. Now, Romer's ideas had been rejected, and about the only choice he had was to enact the measures that had already been rejected. And what were those measures? To create a lottery and to create casino gambling, legalized gambling. Voters overwhelmingly approved that, since it did not require them to pay any taxes. Any money that might be gained through the state of Louisiana would be gained through gamblers losing their money. Now, I misspoke a few moments ago. I talked about Edwards, the Democrat, and Romer, the Republican. That's wrong. In the election of 1988, both men were Democrats. But in the election of 1992, Buddy Romer changes parties. So now I'm right, aren't I? Romer, the Republican, is running against, again, Edwin Edwards. Now, even though Romer changed parties in the election of 1992, he did not have the endorsement of his own party. The the Republican Party did not refuse to endorse him. Now, Edwin Edwards ran as a Democrat again, and everyone assumed that those two men, Edwards and Romer, were going to finish in the top two. Maybe Romer would be one and Edwards would be two. Maybe Edwards would be one and Romer would be two. But nevertheless, one or the other, they would both be one and two. Instead, a white supremacist by the name of David Duke, who was the former Grand Dragon or something of the KKK, ran a strong race and finished second. So Romer's out. Romer has lost. And in that runoff between Edwards and Duke, which became known as the runoff from hell, that runoff attracted national media attention, which poor Louisiana could ill afford to get. What we needed was some positive media attention, but no, the bad news keeps coming and coming and coming. So what you've got is an often indicted but never convicted a former governor, Edwin Edwards, and you've got the former Grand Dragon of the Ku Klux Klan running against each other for the governorship of Louisiana. And it produced one of the best political bumper stickers in the history of mankind. All over Louisiana, bumper stickers appeared, and it simply said, "Vote for the crook. It's important." What a sad state of affairs when everyone acknowledges that Edwin Edwards is probably corrupt, but being corrupt is better than being a racist. The media began to dig deeply into David Duke's background. They turned up even more dirt, even more information that was damaging to David Duke, including some photographs of when he had been an undergraduate at LSU and would give speeches in Free Speech Alley on the LSU campus, dressed in a Nazi uniform with a swastika on the sleeve and the whole regalia. And the result was that Edwards spanks David Duke uh, convincingly. Edwards gets 61%, while Duke only gets 39% of the total vote. All right, so Edwin Edwards is back in office for the fourth go around. Well, what does he do in this fourth term? Well, he balances the budget. He increases spending for education, for healthcare, and for welfare. But there are scandals in his administration. One of the scandals was regarding Medicaid. Now, various state agencies grew because there were a large number of Louisiana residents who were eligible for Medicaid. Now, to be eligible for Medicaid, you've got to be sick without, pretty much without insurance. If you have insurance, your insurance pays for it, right? But if you're on Medicaid, the government pretty much pays for all of it. Funds that were being spent on Medicaid in Louisiana grew to about $3 billion. That's with a B. $3 billion in the 1990s, and it was a. Remember, this is corrupt Louisiana, where corruption is taken for granted. Let me stop here and give you a little story about Edwin Edwards. True story. It was about during this time that Governor Edwards gave a press conference on the steps of the state capitol in Baton Rouge. Now, remember, by this time he's been accused many times of corruption. Um, but none of it has ever really stuck. Remember the Teflon governor? One of the reporters there that day, there were TV reporters and radio reporters and local and state and national media there. Someone said, Governor, what would it take to ruin you politically in Louisiana? And the answer that Edwards gave would have got him impeached in most states, but not in Louisiana. Because his answer to the question, what would it take to ruin you politically in the state of Louisiana? Here was his answer: to be found in bed with a dead girl or a live boy. Now, I'm not making that up. Now, can you imagine what would have happened to most politicians if they had given that answer to that question? They would have been ridden out of town on a rail, but not that day. Most of the reporters laughed. They thought it was funny. They said, "Oh, Governor Edwards, what a great sense of humor he had." Good gracious. $3 billion just in Medicare, Medicaid. Uh, obvious, an obvious invitation to corruption on a grand scale. Many Edwards supporters got into the hospital and nursing home business in order to take advantage of these expanded Medicaid programs. The federal government noticed that Louisiana was feeding at the public trough, and they cut Medicaid funding to Louisiana by $1 billion in between 1995 and 1996. And when they cut $1 billion of $3 billion, now what would you normally expect if the Medicaid budget was cut by a third? You would have expected that there would have been a serious reduction of absolutely necessary uh, services, but it didn't happen. There was no discernible suffering in patient care quality when the cut was introduced, leading a lot of people to believe that the $1 billion was never a part of the health care, but was rather going into the pockets of corrupt people. Now, remember that one of the things that Buddy Roemer did before he left office, he was sort of forced by circumstances, forced against his will, to support the lottery and support casino gambling. Many Edwards supporters got involved in the ownership of casinos, especially doing consulting work for the riverboat casinos that began to pop up all over the state of Louisiana. And among them was Edwin Edwards' son, Stephen, who received $230,000 for consulting fees. Now, I put those in air quotes because he really didn't do any work for that money. He certainly got it. Now, was it nepotism? Did he get it because his daddy was the governor? Well, possible. Stephen Edwards' father-in-law made $2.5 million in a riverboat buyout deal. Now, the casinos in Louisiana, the law said that they couldn't be on land. Don't make me explain that. I've never understood that myself. That was the law, which explains why all of these early casinos were riverboat casinos. But everybody knew that, or everyone hoped that coming down the road at some point in the future would be land-based casinos. Now, a riverboat casino can only be operated where there's water, there's a lake, or there's a river, right? But land is everywhere. And so people sort of understood that land-based casinos were coming down the road, and when they got there, somebody was going to make a pile of money. It was a guaranteed moneymaker because you could build a casino wherever you wanted to build it. You were not limited by water. A board, a committee named by Edwards, awarded contracts to Harrah's Casino, Harrah, Harrah, which is very famous in Las Vegas. Uh, Harrah, according to the deal, would maintain a 53% ownership in the casino, but almost 14% of it would be owned by a group of Louisiana businessmen who had connections to Edwin Edwards. Now, one of the first of these land-based casinos to be built was in New Orleans, and it never lived up to its financial expectations. In order to keep the casino from closing, the state government bailed them out financially with millions of dollars in tax reductions. And there were things like video poker. The company who had the contract to distribute the video poker machines had connections to organized crime, including the Genovese and Gambino mafia family. The machines were made by Bally, um, who made pinball machines. That's where they had become famous, Bally pinball machines. The machines were never distributed, and the company went bankrupt after accepting a $10 million advance from Bally. Later, the brother of Carlos Marcello was indicted and convicted of defrauding Bally of that $10 million. And of course, squarely in the middle of all of this is the thought that where there's smoke, there's got to be fire. And that where there's corruption, Edwin Edwards has to have some role in it. Now, in the election of 1996, Edwards announced that he would not seek reelection. And uh, several former governors, including Dave Treen, Buddy Roemer, and State Senator Mike Foster, who was a lifelong Democrat who had recently switched to the Republican Party, sort of like Roemer did. They all entered as Republicans. For Democrats, black U.S. Congressman William Jefferson and Cleo Fields filed to run, each of them hoping to gather most, if not all, of Louisiana's black voters. Because now the percentage of Louisiana's population of black voters had continued to grow over the years. In September of 1995, Jefferson dropped out, which gave Fields a better chance with black voters. Other Democrats, including State Treasurer at that time, Mary Landrieu, the sister of New Orleans Mayor Moon Landrieu, I'm sorry, the daughter of New Orleans Mayor Moon Landrieu, and by this time, Lieutenant Governor Melinda Schwegman, the daughter of uh, uh, that Mr. Schwegman who had run for governor years earlier. Remember him? He was the grocery millionaire. Both women stressed political and social reform in their campaigns. Mike Foster and Cleo Fields made the runoff. So you've got the white Republican Foster and the black Democrat Cleo Fields, and they're in the runoff. And across the state, voters defeated incumbents who were longtime Edwards backers. So this trickle down effect, um, uh, the perception by many Louisianians that Edwards was corrupt, damaged um, the people who had supported him all these years. Many of those of Edwards' people were defeated as well. And as a result of the election of 1996, the Republican Mike Foster, by the way, and I had mentioned this a long time ago, and you've probably forgotten, but remember we've talked at length about the Constitution of 1898 and how it completed pretty much the disfranchisement of black Louisiana voters. Who was the governor of Louisiana when that took place? A Republican, a Democrat by the name of Murphy Foster. And Murphy Foster, the Democrat, was the grandfather of Mike Foster, the Republican. Mike Foster won 63% of the vote to 37%, which was just about as bad as the results from Edwin Edwards and David Duke. Now, for different reasons, obviously. And Republicans also increased. So not only in the election of '96 was there a Republican governor back in the governor's mansion, a Republican governor, but the Republicans also increased their numbers in the state legislature. All right. So let's talk about Mike Foster as the governor, 1996 to 2000. We're getting close, aren't we? We're getting close to 2020. How many more lectures will there be? I'm not really sure. One thing is I need to go back when I finish with Mike Foster. I'm going to sort of jump back in time, and I'm going to pick up discussing Louisiana state constitutions. I think that the last state constitution that we discussed in any detail was the Constitution of 1898. We might have mentioned the Constitution of 1924, but not in any detail. We need to talk about that. Okay, so Mike Foster promised political reform, fiscal, that's FISCAL. That's a fancy word that means economic integrity, physical integrity, uh, and strong leadership. And he was a popular governor. He was a very popular governor, and he was considered to be, even though he was elected for the first time in 1996, everyone assumed that he would also become a two-term governor, would be reelected in 2000. Now, in the meantime, though, additional changes are happening in Louisiana politics. The Democrat Mary Landrieu, the daughter of Moon Landrieu, the mayor of New Orleans, and the sister of Mitch Landrieu, who is even today still a prominent Louisiana politician. Mary Landrieu was elected to the U.S. Senate in 1996. The Democrat John Breaux, we all know how to spell Breaux, right? Breaux, John Breaux, from Louisiana. The Democrat John Breaux became one of the most powerful men in the U.S. Senate. The Republican U.S. Representative Robert Bob Livingston was in line for the position of Speaker of the House of Representatives when he suddenly resigned from the Congress in 1999. And it was revealed that it was because he had been found out to have been conducting an extramarital affair. He was messing around with a woman who was not his wife, and it ruined him politically. He said, I could not, in good conscience, stay in the House, especially after being one of the leaders of the unsuccessful attempt to impeach President Bill Clinton for perjuring himself in regard to a similar affair. By the way, Louisiana supported Clinton. in 1992 and in 1996. But in 2000, Louisiana gave its electoral votes to George W. Bush. Now, in the election of 2000, Foster ran for re-election against Democratic United States House of Representatives member William Jefferson. And Foster won an easy victory in that election. After being reelected in the year 2000, um, Foster did uh, support pay raises for teachers, but the state remained near the bottom in pay and student test scores. He began to develop the community college system in Louisiana that we have today. Many of you, uh, when you finished high school, you didn't come directly to a 4-year college. You went to a community college. You went to BRCC or River Parishes or whatever. Um, Good things were happening in Louisiana around 2000, or were beginning to happen. Unemployment was going down. Income was going up. Um, Tax revenues were going up as well. I mean, it makes sense. If income is going up, that means you're going to be paying more taxes, which tells me and should tell you that tax revenues are going to go up as well. Sadly, though, the fastest growing growth industry in the state of Louisiana was the gambling industry. Okay, I'm going to try to pause this thing right now while I find my place in my notes. Hopefully, I'm going to be able to come back to it. If not, we'll just cut this lecture short at about 37 minutes, and I'll pick up with our discussion of other Louisiana constitutions. Okay, let's try this. All right. I did check my notebook, and I don't see the material that I need to finish this lecture. So, what we're going to do, we're going to cut this lecture short, even though it's only 37 minutes and a few seconds. That'll give me time tomorrow to go to my desktop computer in my office at school, download those lectures, and then finish up our lectures for the course. And so, until I see you again, bye bye.